welcome to this video tutorial where I'm going to show you how to draft a lining pattern for the tom jacket, how to sew the lining and how to assemble outer and lining jacket. So this is basically an additional video because there is already a really detailed video how to sew the jacket in its original method with the facing. So this video focuses on the lining. We're going to draft and sew up the lining. Then I will send you over to the original video to sew up the outer jacket. And once the outer jacket and the lining jacket is done, we are going to meet back here again to assemble both pieces. Regarding the difficulty, I wouldn't say that sewing the jacket with a lining is harder. There are more steps, but if you already made this jacket and you had no problems, you will most likely have no problems sewing the jacket with a lining too. Nevertheless, a jacket which is fully lined is not the typical beginner project. You cannot compare it to a scrunchie, obviously. So you should keep that in mind, but I totally believe in you that if you just follow every step, you will be able to do it, even though you are a beginner. Regarding the fabric, I would recommend a thin woven fabric as lining fabric for this jacket. I've used washed cotton fabric, which is not the ideal choice because lining fabrics should always be a little bit slippery so that you can get easily into the jacket. But as the tom jacket is really oversized, I would say that using a cotton fabric is not a problem. If you want to use a thicker or warmer lining fabric like a teddy plush fabric, I would say that could work for the bodice, so you can line the front and the back with it. I would probably not recommend to line your sleeves with a very plushy fabric, but to be honest, I haven't tried it yet, so it might work. Now we're going to start to draft the lining pattern, then we're going to sew up the lining, then I will send you over to the main video to finish the outer jacket. And once the outer jacket and the lining is done, we're going to meet back here again to assemble both lining and outer jacket. Have fun! Before we start with the lining, here are some notes on the outer jacket from your main fabric. Here is an overview with all the pattern pieces you will need from your main fabric. You can simply cut them all out without considering anything further except for these two pieces. The front and back facing are both part of the lining jacket and they are getting some minor changes that I will show now. The front facing is being shortened by 6 centimeters. Simply draw a line parallel to your hem and then add a 1 centimeter seam allowance to the curve. And at your back facing there is only one small change, which is adding a 1 centimeter seam allowance to the outer curve. This is how I cut out the facings from the main fabric. I made the adjustments right to the fabric and didn't make an extra pattern piece because the changes are really small. Here I folded the hem of the front facing 6 centimeters upwards and then I added a 1 centimeter seam allowance at this curve and then I cut out the front facings. And at the back facing, I'm adding a 1 centimeter seam allowance right at this curve. This is being cut on the fold and then I will just cut it out. These are the only two pieces from the main fabric that need adjustments. All the other pieces can be cut regularly, and if you need support for your outer jacket, you can just hop into the main video and see how it should be done. To draft the lining pattern, you will need a large piece of foil or pattern paper, or in this case I just glued together some A4 sheets. We will start with the back piece and therefore place the center back piece on your sheet and then place the outer back piece as well, so that the center and outer back piece are overlapping by 2 centimeters. You can align them at the marking and then just overlap by 2 centimeters because we want to erase the seam allowance. The dividing seams are just decorative, so you don't have to sew them for your lining. And last but not least, we're going to add the yoke piece as well, so that it overlaps by 2 centimeters here as well. And now transfer the back piece to your sheet by drawing all the way around. If you want, you can use a ruler for help to draw the hem and also the center back to get a nice, sharp and straight line. Now once you traced your back piece to your sheet, you can remove the original pattern pieces, and here at the hemline we're going to shorten the back piece by 11 centimeters because the back piece lining is shorter than the main piece. So just draw a parallel line to your hem and this will be the final length of your lining back piece. Now take your back facing and place it to the top center back. You will see that it matches perfectly here, and then just draw the outer curve to your back piece. Then remove the facing and add a 1 centimeter seam allowance right here because the facing will be sewn to your back lining and we need a 1 centimeter seam allowance for that. Now last but not least, we're going to add 1 centimeter right at the seam allowance at the center back. Simply lengthen here by 1 centimeter and then connect it to your hemline. The lining is always a little bit wider and longer than the main jacket to avoid the main jacket to bulge around the lining. For that reason, there is always a little bit of extra ease and length in lining pieces. And now your back lining piece is done. You can now cut it out. Next, we're going to continue with the front piece, which consists of only one piece. So you can just simply transfer the whole front piece to your sheet. Do also transfer the marking at the armhole while the pocket position is not needed. Once it's done, remove the front piece and grab your front facing. Place it to the center front. You will see that it fits perfectly, and then just trace the curve to your front piece as well. The front facing is shorter, which is normal. Then remove the facing again, and the lining piece for the front piece should be shorter as well. So I'm going to shorten right at the height of the front facing right here by 12 centimeters. So simply measure 12 centimeters from your hemline and mark it at the facing line. And right here at the side seam, we're going to shorten by 11 centimeters. And now simply connect both markings and you will get your final front lining length. A little side note at this point for a better understanding, the hemline of your main jacket, which is marked in violet here, will be sewn to the hemline of your lining, which I've marked green here. So both edges should have the same length, but as we've shortened the lining, there are 3 millimeters missing. So to be 100% correct, you should lengthen it here by 3 millimeters as shown by the pink line and then connect it to your armpit. You can do that if you want, but me personally, I haven't done it because 3 millimeters is such a small amount that you can balance it out while sewing. Now we only need to add a 1 centimeter seam allowance right here, and then your front lining piece is done and you can cut it out. Next we're going to make the last lining piece, which is the sleeve lining piece, and therefore take both sleeve pieces and overlap them at the straight edge by 2 centimeters and now pin them together. And here is important that you just pin the pattern pieces and that you don't pin them to your sheet. Now take it and flip it so that it lays mirrored, and then just draw the hemline of your sleeve. Here is a little curve, so we need to make something special. And then turn it back again. Right here is the end of the hem seam allowance, which is 3 centimeters from your hemline, and this is where the hemline that we just drawn to your sheet should meet. It's a little bit longer than the sleeve at this point, which is normal. And now I will just connect the end of the hemline with my armpit, like here. I will do the same thing at the other side too, but first I will trace the sleeve head to my sheet. Make sure to transfer the markings here as well. As mentioned before, at the other side, connect the armpit point with your hemline, and then your sleeve lining piece is done and you can just cut it out. This is what your final lining pieces should look like, and these are the only 3 pieces that are being cut from actual lining fabric. The back piece is being cut on the fold, while the front and sleeve pieces are being cut mirrored. And as we added some extra ease at the center back, you will have to mark it here 1 centimeter away from the fold, because we're going to sew in a little pleat here. And then you only need to cut out the front piece and the sleeve pieces. You will need 1 mirrored pair each. Apart from the pieces that you just cut out from your lining fabric, you will need both front facing pieces, the back facing piece, and one of the two collar pieces that you've cut from your outer fabric. These pieces will be part of the lining jacket as well. And at this point, please reinforce both front facing pieces as well as one or two of the collars. I did forget that at this point, but I did it later and I wouldn't recommend doing it later. I'm using a lightweight interfacing like H180 and it's being pressed to the wrong fabric side. We are now going to complete the front pieces and therefore take your front lining pieces and your front facing and place them right sides facing together and pin them together along the curve. Curves are always a bit harder to pin, so I would recommend to pin at the top and bottom, then at the center, then the quarters, and so on. And this way the fabric will be spread equally. Repeat these steps at the other side too, so you will have a mirrored pair, and then stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Finish the seam allowances with your overlocker or a big zigzag stitch, and last but not least, press the seam flat by pressing the seam allowances towards the lining fabric. At the center back you will find two markings that are 2 centimeters apart and now folded lengthwise so that the right fabric sides are facing. My fabric looks the same from both sides, so it doesn't really matter. And then put a pin right at the marking. We're now going to stitch with a regular straight stitch. Start at the top, back stitch, and then stitch approximately 3 to 4 centimeters. This way we are sewing the pleat. And this is what our pleat will look like now. Next, take your back facing from main fabric, and this is how those two pieces should come together. There is a marking right at the center of your back facing, which will match up with the pleat. Simply fold the pleat to any side of your choice, and here again are curves, so I would recommend to pin at the center back, then at the shoulders, and then right in between. This makes it easier, and you can distribute the fabric equally. Now sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Finish the seam allowances afterwards and then press the seam flat by pressing the seam allowances towards the lining fabric. Now place both front pieces right sides facing on your back piece and pin them together along the shoulders. The seams at the shoulders will meet. As we need to turn the jacket right side out later, we need to leave a turning gap at one of the two sides. The turning gap should be a minimum of 14 centimeters long, depending on how thick your fabric is. My fabric is medium thick and my turning gap is 14 centimeters wide. The thicker your fabric is, the larger the turning gap should be. Now I'm going to remove some pins at one of the side seams and mark my turning gap. The pins are 14 centimeters apart and I will not sew the side seams together between those two pins. Now we're going to stitch across the shoulders and at the sides, leaving the turning gap open. Here you can see the turning gap. I will stitch right until the pin. Here I will backstitch, and then I will continue sewing at the other pin. As always, I'm sewing with a regular straight stitch and the 1 cm seam allowance, and after that I will finish the raw edges with my overlocker, but you can also finish those with a big zigzag stitch instead. I'm finishing all the seams except for the little part where we have left the turning gap. Next we need to sew the sleeves, therefore fold them right sides facing lengthwise and pin them together along the sleeve seam. And if your fabric looks the same from both sides like mine does, make sure that you're pinning a mirrored pair. To check if you have a mirrored pair, place them with the sleeve seam facing outwards, and now both markings should be facing upwards or downwards. Now stitch along the sleeve seams with a 1 cm seam allowance and then finish the raw edges. Next we're going to sew in the sleeves and therefore turn the sleeves right side out while the jacket remains with the wrong fabric side facing out, and you will find a marking at the sleeve head which will meet the marking at the front armhole. Also the side seam and the sleeve seam meet, and then there is another marking at the top of your sleeve head which will match up with your shoulder seam. And this way just pin the sleeve into the armhole all the way around. Right fabric sides are facing, and then repeat this step at the other side too. Once everything is pinned in place, sew with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, and then finish the seam. This is what it should look like now, and now only the collar is missing to complete our lining. Grab one of the 2 collar pieces and pin it right sides facing to your neckline. There is a marking at the collar which marks the center of it. Pin it to your center back. I'm using the same pinning method as always. Next pin at the front, then at the quarters, and then right in between. Now stitch right here with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. And as here is a curve, I will clip into the seam allowances and stop 2 millimeters before my seam so that the collar lays nice and flat. And once you're done, finish the seam with your overlocker or with a big zigzag stitch. Now your lining jacket is done, and I would send you over to the original video to finish the main outer jacket. You only need to sew until minute 12:45, and you can proceed exactly as in the video, except for the facing pieces. You don't need them for the outer jacket anymore because they are already part of your lining jacket. And once your outer jacket is done, please come back so I can show you how to assemble main jacket and lining jacket. Now we're going to assemble the outer jacket and the lining. The outer jacket has dividing seams, pockets, a collar and also sleeves. And your lining jacket has sleeves and also a collar. It is shorter than your main outer jacket. First, we're going to sew those two jackets together along the hemline. Therefore, unfold your jacket and place it with right side facing upwards. Then put your lining jacket on top of it, align the hemlines and pin both jackets together along the hemline. The side seams and also the front edges meet, and then just pin both layers together. Now stitch along the hemline with a regular straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance, and then finish the raw edges with your overlocker or with a big zigzag stitch. This is what it should look like, and for a nice and professional finish, we're going to unfold both jackets once again to press the seam nice and flat, and I'm pressing the seam allowances towards the lining. Next, we're going to pin and sew along the front edges and also the collar. Therefore, fold your sleeves inwards. The right fabric sides are facing up. And now I will grab my lining jacket and put it over so that the sleeves are hidden. And as you can see here, the two colors meet. I will first pin those two jackets together at the top of the collar. And as you can see here, the lining is shorter than your outer jacket, and for that reason the hem of the outer jacket is being pulled inside automatically. And now measure from the seam right down to the hemline. There should be 6 centimeters. And right here at the center front bottom, you will need to leave a little gap of approximately 4 centimeters so we can insert the elastic through that gap later. So here I've put 2 pins as a marking. And then basically just pin everything together along the edges from hem to hem along the front edge, the collar, and at the other side at the bottom you will also need to leave a little gap to be able to insert the elastic later. This is what it should look like, and now we're going to stitch from hem to hem along the collar too, and a little reminder that at both front bottoms you will need to leave that little gap of 4 centimeters to be able to insert the elastic later. If you're sewing the jacket with a zipper, this is how it should be pinned in place. First, mark the right side of your zipper, the one that should be visible from the outside later. Then divide it, and then basically the zipper is pinned in place right between both layers, between the main jacket and the lining jacket. The right side of the zipper is facing the right fabric side of your outer jacket, and you will find markings at the top and bottom where the zipper will start and end. My zipper is too short here because I just used it to show you how it should be done. And then basically just pin the zipper so that it's sandwiched between both layers. And also the fabric side of your zipper is laying flush with your front edge. And in this case also you will have to leave a little gap at the center front bottom at both sides, so you will be able to insert the elastic later. Now we're going to start at the hemline and then backstitch, leave the little gap and then continue sewing. I'm using a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and here at the collar there are a lot of fabric layers, so I would recommend to go over this part using your hand wheel to avoid your needle from breaking. And then just stitch all the way around, and don't forget to leave the little gap at the other side too. This is what it should look like, and at both front bottoms there are little gaps. And now I'm going to clip into the seam allowances along the collar because here are curves as well. And I will stop approximately 2 millimeters before the seam. And also I will trim off the corners at both front bottoms. Next I'm going to finish the seam allowances with my overlocker, but you can also use a big zigzag stitch instead, and I will leave out the area where we left the turning gap. Now it's time to turn your jacket right side out through the turning gap that you've left in one side seam of your lining. Just carefully pull the jacket out. This is what it should look like. Form out the corners nicely, and you will have to push the lining sleeves into the main sleeves. And next we're going to stitch a little channel at the hem so that you can insert the elastic here. Simply measure 6 centimeters from the bottom edge to the seam and pin everything in place. I'm pinning on the inside, but I will stitch from the outside for that reason. Insert your pins vertically. Next we're going to stitch from front edge to create the channel to insert the elastic. I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and a seam allowance of 5.5 centimeters. This is what it should look like, and now grab a large safety pin and attach it to your elastic so you can insert the elastic into the channel. I've cut my elastic to size. You will find measurements for the elastic in the written instructions, and here I've cut it 20 centimeters longer because usually the elastic ends at the height of the front facings, but with this method it will end at the front edge, so it will have to be a little bit longer. Now make sure that your elastic isn't twisted, and also try on the jacket to see if you like the length of the elastic. You should be able to close it at the front without the hemline being too tight. Usually the elastic is being stitched in place at the height of the front facing, but in this case I chose to stitch it down at the height of the pocket edge. If you want, you can also secure it at the front edge, whatever you like, and therefore simply stitch along the hem at the height of your pocket edge or wherever you like with a regular straight stitch at both sides. Now we only need to cut off the excess elastic, therefore pull it out as far as you can and simply cut it off. Next we're going to top stitch along both front edges and the collar for a nice finish, and also to close the both little gaps in the hem. Therefore simply pin along both front edges and the collar from hem to hem, and if you've sewn in a zipper, now you can secure it at both front bottoms too. Next we're going to top stitch. Right here I'm using a regular straight stitch, and I'm stitching with a distance of approximately ½ centimeter from the edge. Now we need to finish the sleeve hem, and therefore pull out your lining sleeve so that both raw edges are laying flush. Make sure that your lining sleeve is not twisted and that both sleeve seams are laying together, and then fold a few centimeters of your outer sleeve inwards to the wrong fabric side, and do the same thing for your lining sleeve as well. Fold it inwards to the wrong fabric side and hold it together like I do here, and with your other hand go through your turning gap in the lining side seam and grab those two fabric layers. Make sure to hold them really tight so that you don't lose them. And now pull out both sleeves through your turning gap. You should now be holding two layers of fabric right sides facing and the sleeve seams meet. This is how the sleeves should come together. Pin two layers of fabric here. Make sure to match up both sleeve seams, and then step by step pin the sleeve hems together. It's a bit weird because you cannot stuff one sleeve into the other, but you basically pin together two layers of fabric right sides facing in a circle. And this is what it should look like. You have pinned only two layers all the way around. It somehow looks like two people are shaking hands. And now I'm going to stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, and afterwards I will finish the seam allowances with my overlocker. This is what it will look like now. And now you can turn the sleeve right side out through your turning gap. And then it's time to repeat these steps with the other sleeve too. And once both sleeve hems are closed, we are going to hem them. Therefore, pin along the hem, make sure that the distance from the edge to your seam is 2 centimeters, and then just pin all the way around. Now stitch with a seam allowance of 2 centimeters with a regular straight stitch to make sure everything stays in place. Before we're going to close the turning gap, a little note on the sew on snaps. It consists of 2 parts, and the one that will be sewn to the outer jacket, which I will do on the left side here, can easily be sewn through both fabric layers, because the back side of your stitching will be on the inside and won't be visible when you wear the jacket, and at the opposite side this is where the snap belongs, and if you stitch through both layers the stitching would be visible from the outside. So you can use the turning gap and go through the turning gap and then stitch the other side of the snap just to your lining jacket layer. It's a bit fumbly, but you can do it, and in this case the stitching won't be visible from the outside. Now we only need to close the turning gap. I will use my sewing machine to do so because I'm lazy, but you can also stitch by hand. Just fold the edges 1 centimeter to the inside and pin everything in place. And now stitch that part with a little seam allowance of 2 millimeters with a regular straight stitch to close the turning gap.